It was a sunny afternoon when Dr. Marcus Hill, a young, accomplished black physician, walked into the elegant country club for what he thought would be a simple meeting. He had been invited by his patient, Emma Thompson, to discuss her ongoing treatment plan in a more comfortable setting. Emma, a kind-hearted woman in her 60s, often spoke of her family, especially her husband, Richard, a staunch traditionalist with a reputation for being opinionated and at times overbearing. Marcus had no idea he was about to step into a storm. The lobby was bustling with chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the murmur of polite conversations. Marcus, dressed in a crisp navy suit, carried himself with a quiet confidence. He had faced adversity before, growing up in a modest neighborhood, working tirelessly through medical school, and proving doubters wrong at every step. Yet, nothing had quite prepared him for what lay ahead that day. Emma greeted him warmly, her silver hair shining under the chandeliers. "Dr. Hill, thank you for coming. My husband is eager to meet you. He's been curious about the man helping me through all this." Marcus smiled, offering a polite nod. "It's my pleasure, Mrs. Thompson. I'm glad to have the opportunity to explain everything in person." They walked together to a private dining room where Richard Thompson waited. Marcus noticed the moment he entered that the air shifted. Richard, a man in his 70s with sharp blue eyes and an air of authority, sat at the head of the table. His gaze hardened the instant he saw Marcus, and the slight twitch in his jaw betrayed his disapproval. He didn't stand or extend a hand. Instead, he simply said, "So, you're the doctor?" "Yes, Mr. Thompson. Dr. Marcus Hill." "It's a pleasure to meet you," Marcus replied, his tone steady and professional. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus as though he were an unwelcome guest. "A bit young for a doctor, aren't you?" Marcus chuckled softly. "I've heard that before, sir, but I assure you I'm more than qualified." Emma quickly interjected, trying to ease the tension. "Richard, Dr. Hill has been wonderful. He's the reason I've been feeling so much better lately." Richard raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint sneer. "Is that so? Well, we'll see if that holds true. I've always believed experience matters more than anything else." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus kept his composure, choosing not to rise to the bait. He had encountered men like Richard before, men who judged him by his appearance before even giving him a chance. But Marcus also knew the importance of staying calm and focused, especially at moments like these. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Richard wasn't just skeptical. He was determined to undermine Marcus. He questioned his credentials, his methods, even his background, all under the guise of concern for Emma's health. "Where did you say you studied again? Was it one of those newer schools?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Marcus calmly explained his education and experience, but Richard barely listened. Instead, he launched into a tirade about how things were better in the old days when doctors were seasoned and came from respectable families. Emma's attempts to redirect the conversation were futile. Richard's tone grew harsher, and his words cut deeper. "Forgive me for being blunt," Richard said at one point, his voice loud enough to turn heads outside the room. "But I find it hard to believe someone like you could truly understand the complexities of someone like Emma's condition." The insinuation was clear, and Marcus felt a familiar knot tightening in his chest. But before he could respond, Emma's voice broke through, firm and unwavering. "Richard, that's enough. Dr. Hill has done more for me than you could ever imagine. He's here because I trust him." Richard's face darkened, his pride clearly wounded. "You trust him? Well, let's see how far that trust gets us when things take a turn." Marcus didn't flinch, but inside he could feel the weight of Richard's words pressing down. He had been in countless difficult situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about him. It was about proving to Emma, and perhaps even to Richard, that he was more than capable of rising above the prejudice and proving his worth. As the tension reached its peak, a server entered the room, breaking the moment. "Your meals are ready to be served," she announced with a bright smile. Emma gave Marcus an apologetic look, while Richard simply muttered, Let's get this over with. But Marcus knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. This was only the beginning of a battle he hadn't asked for but one he was determined to face with grace and dignity. Little did Richard know, his underestimation of Marcus would lead to a series of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about people, respect, and redemption. And as the first course was served, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was yet to come. The meal began in strained silence, with the faint clinking of cutlery filling the room. Marcus remained calm, his posture straight and his hands steady, even as he felt Richard's eyes on him. The older man scrutinized his every move, clearly searching for any sign of weakness or imperfection. Marcus, however, had learned long ago how to maintain his composure under pressure. His journey to becoming a doctor had been marked by countless challenges, each one shaping him into the man he was today. As the server poured the wine and retreated, Emma tried to steer the conversation toward lighter topics. "Dr. Hill, why don't you tell Richard a bit about your work at the hospital? I think he'd be interested in hearing about the advancements you've been a part of." Marcus smiled politely. "Of course, I specialize in internal medicine, but I've also worked on research projects focusing on chronic conditions like arthritis and diabetes. We've made some promising strides in treatment options recently." Richard raised an eyebrow, swirling his wine glass. "Research, huh? That's all well and good. But I've always believed a doctor's worth is measured by their bedside manner. Anyone can crunch numbers or write papers. The real question is whether you can truly connect with your patients." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I agree, Mr. Thompson. Connecting with patients is one of the most important aspects of my job. It's about building trust and understanding what they need, not just physically but emotionally as well." "That's easy to say," Richard replied, his tone sharp. "But actions speak louder than words, and from what I've seen, most young people these days are all talk." Emma shot her husband a warning glance, but Marcus remained unfazed. He knew Richard was testing him, pushing him to see if he would crack under the pressure. Instead of taking the bait, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "You're absolutely right, sir. Actions do speak louder than words. That's why I'm here, to show you and Mrs. Thompson that I'm fully committed to her care." For a moment, Richard seemed taken aback by Marcus's calm confidence. He didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to take a long sip of his wine. The tension in the room was palpable, but Marcus refused to let it rattle him. He had faced far worse than a disapproving father-in-law figure. As the meal progressed, Emma did her best to keep the conversation flowing, though Richard remained mostly curt and distant. Marcus couldn't help but wonder what had shaped Richard's worldview. Was it simply a product of his upbringing, or was there something deeper at play? He didn't know much about the man beyond what Emma had shared. A former businessman with strong opinions and a rigid sense of tradition. But Marcus had learned that people were rarely as simple as they seemed. "You seem awfully patient," Richard said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I suppose that's a requirement in your line of work." Marcus glanced up, meeting Richard's piercing gaze. "Patience is important, yes. But so is perseverance. Sometimes the only way to make progress is to keep pushing forward, even when the odds are against you." Richard let out a dry laugh. "Perseverance, huh? That's a fancy way of saying you're stubborn." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "I suppose you could see it that way, but I'd like to think it's more about determination. When someone's health is on the line, you can't afford to give up." Emma placed a hand on Marcus's arm, her expression warm. "And that's exactly why I trust him, Richard. He's been there every step of the way, answering my questions, listening to my concerns. He genuinely cares." Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention back to his plate, cutting into his steak with a bit more force than necessary. Marcus could sense that his words had struck a nerve, though he wasn't sure whether it was anger, frustration, or something else entirely. The rest of the meal passed in relative quiet, with Emma doing most of the talking. She shared stories about her grandchildren, her garden, and her plans for an upcoming charity event. Marcus listened attentively, offering kind words and encouragement where he could. Richard, meanwhile, remained distant, his demeanor cold and unyielding. As dessert was served, Emma excused herself to take a phone call, leaving Marcus and Richard alone in the room. The silence between them was heavy, almost suffocating, but Marcus wasn't one to back down. He met Richard's gaze head-on, refusing to look away. "You've done well for yourself," Richard said finally, his voice low. "I'll give you that. But I've seen men like you before, men who think they can climb their way to the top and forget where they came from." Marcus's expression remained calm, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. "With all due respect, sir, I haven't forgotten where I came from. My background is a big part of who I am, and it's shaped how I approach my work and my life." Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Is that so? Then tell me, Dr. Hill, what drives you? Why do you do what you do?" Marcus took a deep breath, his mind flashing back to the countless nights he had spent studying, the sacrifices he had made, the moments of doubt and triumph. "I became a doctor because I wanted to make a difference. Growing up, I saw how lack of access to healthcare affected my community, how it tore families apart. I didn't want to stand by and do nothing. I wanted to be part of the solution." Richard's expression softened ever so slightly, though his skepticism remained. "That sounds noble, but words are easy. Proving it, that's another matter entirely." Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady and resolute. "I know I can't change your opinion overnight, Mr. Thompson, but I hope in time my actions will speak for themselves." Richard didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on Marcus, as though trying to read his mind. The room felt charged, the air thick with unspoken tension. Marcus held his ground, refusing to be intimidated or diminished. Before Richard could say anything more, Emma returned, her cheerful demeanor breaking the intensity of the moment. "I'm so sorry about that," she said, taking her seat. "What did I miss?" Marcus glanced at Richard, who seemed to retreat back into his guarded shell. "Nothing important," Richard muttered, picking up his glass. "Just a bit of conversation." Emma smiled, oblivious to the undercurrents between the two men. "Well, I'm glad you're getting to know each other. It's important to me that you two get along." Marcus offered a polite nod, while Richard remained silent. Though the meal was nearly over, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would test not only his patience and perseverance, but also his ability to rise above prejudice and prove that character, not skin color, was what truly mattered.